History often hides its turning points behind illusions of strength. Empires rarely collapse at the moment they appear weakest. More often, they fall when they look unbreakable, when their flags still wave, their armies still march, and their leaders still speak in the language of permanence. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union stood exactly at that deceptive peak. To the world, it was a giant. To those who knew where to look, it was already bleeding from a wound no parade could conceal. What follows is not the story of tanks crossing borders or missiles on alert, but of numbers, barrels, and quiet decisions made far from cameras. It is the story of how an empire built on ideology was undone by economics, and how a single commodity became the lever that snapped a superpower in half. If you studied a world map in 1980, one country dominated the page like a shadow stretched too far. The Soviet Union spanned 11 time zones, commanded nearly 40,000 nuclear warheads, and maintained an army of 4 million men poised along the edge of Europe. From Washington, London, or Paris, the Soviet bear appeared unstoppable, muscular, menacing, eternal. It looked like the kind of empire historians would one day describe as having endured for centuries. But that image only held if you stayed at a distance. If you looked beyond the missile parades rolling through Red Square and instead examined the balance sheets tucked inside the Soviet Ministry of Finance, a far darker reality emerged. Beneath the armor was a body failing fast. The Soviet economy was not merely struggling, it was decaying. And at its core lay a dangerous addiction to a single resource. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer a balanced industrial powerhouse. It had quietly transformed into something far more fragile, a petrostate. Like an addict dependent on a single fix, the system survived on one substance alone: high-priced crude oil. For decades, the communist system had failed its people. Factories were bloated and inefficient. Collective farms could not produce enough grain to feed the population. Soviet technology lagged a generation behind the West. But in the 1970s, fate intervened. The Arab oil embargo sent energy prices soaring, and suddenly billions in hard currency flowed into Moscow. It felt like salvation. That oil windfall allowed the aging men of the Politburo to postpone reality. They used petrodollars to buy American grain to prevent famine. They imported Western technology they could not develop themselves. Most importantly, they financed an enormous military expansion and kept distant communist allies afloat, from Cuba to Vietnam. As long as oil remained expensive, the illusion of a functioning superpower could be maintained. The leadership convinced itself the party would never end. But across the Atlantic, a new administration was coming to power, one that saw the weakness clearly. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House with advisors who were done managing decline. They did not want to contain the Soviet Union. They wanted to break it. Among them was William Casey, the newly appointed head of the CIA. Casey was not a theorist. He was a veteran of covert war, a former OSS officer who had run agents behind enemy lines in World War II. He understood that modern conflict was fought as much with spreadsheets as with soldiers. Money, supply chains, and pressure points mattered more than slogans. Casey ordered a classified examination of the Soviet economy. What came back shocked even seasoned analysts. The report revealed that up to 80% of Soviet hard currency earnings came from oil and gas exports. Worse still, the system depended on oil staying above a critical price threshold. Drop below it and the Soviet economy would not slow, it would seize. To Casey, this was revelation. He had found the empire's Achilles heel. But there was a problem. The United States could not collapse oil prices alone. America consumed oil, it did not control it. To flood the market, Casey needed a partner with unmatched production capacity. He needed Saudi Arabia. This led to one of the most secretive diplomatic maneuvers of the Cold War. At the time, US-Saudi relations were delicate. The Saudis officially claimed neutrality. They benefited enormously from high oil prices and controlled the heart of OPEC. Why would they sabotage their own profits to hurt Moscow? Because money was not their greatest fear, survival was. The early 1980s were terrifying for the Saudi royal family. Iran had just undergone a revolution. Soviet troops were entrenched in Afghanistan, inching closer to the Persian Gulf. The House of Saud felt surrounded. Casey understood this fear and used it. He traveled to Riyadh for private meetings held far from journalists and diplomats. No transcripts exist, but the consequences reveal the offer. Casey warned of Soviet encirclement. He promised American military protection, advanced surveillance aircraft, modern weapons, and above all, a guarantee that the Saudi monarchy would not stand alone. In return, he asked for one thing: open the taps. The plan was not dramatic or immediate. It was slow suffocation. At first, Saudi leaders hesitated. Lower prices meant less revenue. But Casey argued that reduced income was preferable to annihilation. He even framed it as a religious duty. The Soviets were killing Muslims in Afghanistan. Crippling Moscow would strike a blow for the Ummah. Eventually, the Saudis agreed. While this economic weapon was being prepared, Washington applied pressure elsewhere. The Reagan administration blocked Soviet pipeline projects to Europe, pressured Western banks to cut off credit, and forced Moscow into a ruinously expensive arms race. The goal was simple: stretch the Soviet budget until it snapped the moment oil collapsed. By 1985, the trap was ready. In Moscow, a new leader had emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Young and energetic, he planned to reform the system through perestroika. But his plans rested on a fatal assumption: that oil revenues would continue. Soviet budgets were written with oil priced near $30 a barrel. Gorbachev believed he had time. He did not know the rope had already been cut. In the summer of 1985, Saudi Arabia made its move. 4 years, the kingdom had acted as OPEC's swing producer, cutting its own output to stabilize prices while others cheated on quotas. Frustrated and emboldened, the Saudis changed strategy. In September, Oil Minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced a shift. Saudi Arabia would no longer defend oil prices, it would fight for market share. To casual observers, it sounded technical. To traders, it was an earthquake. Saudi pumps roared to life. Millions of barrels flooded the market. Supply overwhelmed demand. Prices collapsed with ruthless speed. $30 became $25, then $20, then lower. In Moscow, confusion reigned. Planners assumed it was temporary. They kept spending, kept fighting in Afghanistan, kept subsidizing allies across the communist world. Hard currency reserves vanished as officials waited for a rebound that never came. By early 1986, oil fell toward $10 a barrel. Each dollar lost meant roughly $1 billion gone from Soviet revenues. And oil was not just income, it was food. The Soviet Union could not feed itself. Collective farms failed. Grain had to be imported from North America, paid for in hard currency or gold. Rubles were worthless outside the bloc. When oil prices collapsed, the bread supply collapsed with them. The empire did not fall to bombs or invasions, but to empty ledgers, silent ports, and bread lines stretching into the cold. By early 1986, the mood inside the Kremlin had shifted from denial to fear. Gorbachev was receiving confidential briefings from his finance ministers, and none of them carried good news. The reserves were gone. There was no money to import the machinery needed to modernize Soviet industry. Even consumer goods, already scarce, were now on the chopping block. Gorbachev was staring into an abyss. He had promised renewal. He had promised reform. But reform requires resources. When the treasury is empty, there is no transformation, only damage control. And fate, cruel as ever, chose that precise moment to strike again. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded. The disaster drained billions from an economy that no longer had billions to spare. Entire cities had to be evacuated. Vast regions were poisoned. Cleanup costs soared while oil revenues collapsed. It was catastrophe layered on catastrophe, a financial siege paired with a technological nightmare. The Soviet leadership was overwhelmed. But the pressure did not ease. Washington quietly urged the Saudis to hold their line. Low prices, they were told, were bleeding the common enemy. Saudi Arabia, cushioned by massive reserves, complied. They kept production high, driving oil prices to levels that made Soviet extraction unprofitable. Siberian oil fields were costly to operate, brutal to maintain. At $10 a barrel, the Soviets were losing money on every drop they pumped. What had once been their greatest strength became an anchor dragging them under. The psychological shock was immense. For decades, Soviet elites had believed history favored them, that capitalism was unstable, doomed to collapse under its own excesses. Now they were being crushed by the very mechanics of market economics. They saw, with dawning horror, that their system had survived not on ideological superiority, but on a lucky streak of high oil prices. When the luck vanished, so did the confidence. Infighting erupted inside the Communist Party. Hardliners blamed Gorbachev. Reformers blamed decades of stagnation. But arguments could not solve the central problem. The numbers did not work. The state was bankrupt. That bankruptcy rippled outward. The Soviet Union was not just a country, it was an empire. Eastern Europe had been held together with subsidies, cheap oil, and quiet coercion. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, these states survived because Moscow paid the bills. When the money dried up, the glue dissolved. Gorbachev informed Eastern European leaders that the support was over. They would now chart their own paths. He called it the Sinatra Doctrine. They could do it their way. This was not an ideological awakening. It was a budgetary necessity. Once people realized Soviet tanks would not come, not because of mercy but because Moscow could no longer afford fuel, the streets filled. The revolutions of 1989 were fueled by courage, but enabled by insolvency. The oppressor had gone broke. The oil weapon was invisible but lethal. It shattered balance sheets instead of buildings. It hollowed out a superpower without firing a shot. And almost no one recognized it as it happened. The CIA analysts who had first flagged the danger were right. One thread held the Soviet system together. When it was pulled, the entire fabric unraveled. The oil crash of 1986 was the moment the floor gave way. In New York trading rooms, $10 oil felt like a celebration. Gasoline was cheap. Growth surged. But in the Kremlin it felt like a wake. Gorbachev studied the figures and understood that perestroika was already dead. Years later he admitted the oil collapse devastated all their plans. That was putting it mildly. The Soviet Union was drowning in a liquidity crisis, bills due, cash gone. Loans taken in the optimistic 1970s were now coming due, and Western banks panicked. Credit vanished overnight. Moscow was shut out of global finance. Desperate, Gorbachev sent envoys begging for loans from West Germany, even from the United States. The symbolism was brutal, the leader of world communism asking capitalists for mercy. And mercy came with conditions: human rights, political reform, withdrawal from Afghanistan. Financial weakness forced political surrender. The empire retreated, not on battlefields but across negotiation tables. At home, life deteriorated rapidly. With no hard currency, imports stopped. Shelves emptied completely. Soap, sugar, medicine gone. The Soviet social contract collapsed. People had surrendered freedom in exchange for stability. When stability vanished, the bargain died with it. Strikes erupted. Siberian coal miners walked off the job, not for ideology, but because there was no soap to wash coal dust from their skin. Meanwhile, the Saudi strategy succeeded perfectly. Low prices crushed high-cost producers and reshaped global power. Oil proved stronger than missiles. A superpower had been brought to its knees without bloodshed. Washington understood the lesson. Saudi Arabia was not just an energy supplier, it was a strategic weapon. This realization would guide American foreign policy for decades. By 1989, the Soviet Union was running on fumes. Gold reserves were sold off in London and Zurich just to buy wheat. Even that lifeline ran dry. Gorbachev slashed military spending, withdrew from Afghanistan not because it was unwinnable, but because it was unaffordable. The empire had simply run out of fuel. Finally came Eastern Europe. Maintaining control cost billions Moscow no longer had. When Berliners began tearing down the wall in November 1989, Soviet troops stood aside, not out of goodwill but poverty. At $10 oil, tanks stayed parked. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. Commentators spoke of ideology, freedom, democracy. All true. But the final blow was economic. It came from an oil minister opening valves in the desert. The lesson endured. Petrostates stand on sand. When prices fall, states fall with them. Venezuela learned it. Modern Russia remembers it. Even today, the ghost of 1986 haunts the Kremlin. For the United States, the victory created a dangerous belief that financial warfare could replace traditional war. Sanctions became the new missiles. The battlefield shifted to banks, currencies, and markets. But weapons evolve. And every tool has limits. The Soviet Union didn't die in an explosion. It died when the math failed. It had enough weapons to end civilization but couldn't afford bread. A giant with steel armor and clay feet. The Cold War ended not with a bang but with a margin call.